People whose hearts truly care about what's most important. It's an honor to address you. And it's a weighty honor because your lives are treated as precious by yourselves. And you have in your hands the greatest gift that people have, a yes and a no. Some people have lost that, and they just follow the crowd. One of the functions of religion is to prevent us from violating our humanity. Another function of religion is to call us and remind us of our full human potential, to reach and be embraced by the divine. Human beings are gifted with a yes and a no. On July 16th, 1945, the world changed and placed before humanity a unique choice that it didn't have before. No other generation was given the choice as to whether it would be the last generation. On that day, in a New Mexico desert, chillingly named Jornada de Muerto, the Journey of Death, a thunderous roar and a shock wave, a huge pillar of smoke rose 30,000 feet, creating the first icon of this choice, a fearsome mushroom cloud. A blast of energy of unprecedented destructive magnitude bathed the surrounding mountains in brilliant colors, seen up to 150 miles away. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the director of the Los Alamos laboratory that had created this atomic bomb as part of the Manhattan Engineer District of the War Department, uttered a sober description from the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become destroyer of worlds, death. That's what we cannot allow to happen to our world. A single large nuclear weapon could release explosive power comparable to all the energy released from all the conventional weapons used in the history of humanity. The bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were relatively small. They were no larger than 15 kilotons. We have bombs in the megaton range. Megaton would be 1,000,000 tons of TNT. 1,000,000 tons of TNT represents an unimaginable destructive capacity. And there have been bombs that we tested in the multiple megaton range, 20 megatons, which would be thousands of Hiroshimas. The Soviets tested one that was 50 megatons. That would be 3,000 Hiroshimas. I don't think the human imagination can comprehend such catastrophic destruction or imagine the amount of organization, intellectual capacity, and finances to engage in this horrific. Well, let me quote General Lee Butler, who was head of the targeting and readiness of the entire United States arsenal. He was one of the people who wrote the first single integrated operating plan for the Strategic Command. General Butler said, "Despite all the evidence, we've yet to fully grasp the monstrous effect of these weapons, that the consequences of their use defy reason, transcending time and space, poisoning the earth and deforming its inhabitants. Nuclear weapons are inherently dangerous, hugely expensive, militarily inefficient. Accepting nuclear weapons as the ultimate arbiter of conflict condemns the world to live under a dark cloud of perpetual anxiety. Worse, it codifies mankind's most murderous instincts as an acceptable resort when other options for resolving conflict fail." I've spent years studying nuclear weapons effects. I've investigated a distressing array of accidents and incidents involving strategic weapons and forces. I came away from that experience deeply troubled by what I saw as the burden of building, maintaining nuclear arsenals, the grotesque destructive war plans, the daily operational risks, and the constant prospect of a crisis that would hold the fate of entire societies at risk. So I've spent time with General Butler, and one of the things he's emphasized is the number of accidents that have happened. A computer chip that failed to recognize the distinction between a sunrise and missile launches that gave our decision makers but minutes to decide what might happen. As President Reagan said, 6 minutes to decide how to respond to a blip on a radar scope and decide whether to unleash Armageddon. How could anyone apply reason to a situation like that? After the Cold War, you thought it would be over. In 1995, the Norwegians set off a weather satellite and notified 20 countries that they had done this, but it didn't get passed up the command and control. Boris Yeltsin was told about it, and he opened the football, and the codes were, there are two sets of codes. The first codes were opened, the only time in history that happened there. And it looked like it was going to go over Moscow. If that had been the case, it would have been a high-altitude explosion, frying the electrical capacity of the Russians, the first opening of a nuclear exchange. He had less than 8 minutes to decide whether we would be here today. And he said the reason why he wasn't that concerned to do the next codes was that he didn't think Bill Clinton would do it. But imagine if that had happened during a crisis. How close we came in 1983, just after the Korean airliner had been shot down. Stanislav Petrov was watching the computers in Moscow, and they all indicated a full-scale American launch. And he disobeyed his protocols and didn't pass it up the command and control. I interviewed him for that, and I said, what gave you the courage and humility to do what you did? And he said, I was a computer engineer. I knew computers make mistakes. And God told me he didn't want the world to end. My superiors didn't know whether to punish me for violating my protocols or to reward me for saving the world. But what bothered them the most was I believed in God. No human being should have to be in that possession of a yes and no that he had to make at that moment. Mikhail Gorbachev said, it is my firm belief that the infinite and uncontrollable fury of nuclear weapons should never be held in the hands of any mere mortal ever again for any reason. And I want to publicly thank Secretary Shultz for what he did with President Reagan in Geneva when they declared collectively in 1985, a nuclear war can never be won and therefore must never be fought. And I call upon our government to immediately affirm that. We have in our circle, as you saw, it's quite, I mean, you have to forgive us for being mostly old white men. Maybe. But, you know, we're human too. We count. But we want to invite more people to join us. We want more women. We want more young people. We want to expand our voice. But this group gives some weight and gravitas. We're experienced in law, diplomacy, technology. My goodness, we have a former Secretary of Defense in it, pleading. And I'm going to read a little bit about our statement, what we're about, what you'd be joining up with. We believe that the indiscriminate destructive effects of nuclear weapons render them incompatible with civilized values and international humanitarian law. International law prohibits the use of weapons of indiscriminate effect that cannot distinguish between civilians and combatants, cause unnecessary suffering, irreversible environmental damage, and nuclear weapons can hardly be used in compatible manner with those restraints. The threat to use them and annihilate vast numbers of innocent people, inflict indescribable suffering and environmental destruction is immoral and contrary to the purposes for which the blessings of life have been given to us. Our goal is to achieve the universal, legally enforceable, non-discriminatory, and verifiable elimination of nuclear weapons. Now let me say that's what the vast majority of nations of the world have been demanding. As you know, The southern hemisphere of the planet is nuclear weapons free from nuclear weapons free zones. There's a Treaty of Rarotonga making the South Pacific nuclear weapons free. The Treaty of beautiful names. The Treaty of Pelindabra making Africa nuclear weapons free. The Treaty of Tlatelolco making Latin America nuclear weapons free. The Treaty of Bangkok making Southeast Asia. The Treaty of Astana making Central Asia. People don't know all of the progress. We had over 70,000. We're now down to less than 15,000. Let me remind you, if a mere 100 were to go off, it would throw in excess of 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere and render agriculture as we know it impossible and end civilization. So we've moved from MAD, mutually assured destruction, to what we've now learned, if they're used, to SAD, self-assured destruction. It is a madness, a kind of worship, a kind of idolatry. The use of these weapons against any state is inhuman and useless against terrorists. Chemical and biological weapons have long ago been abolished. Imagine if the Chemical Weapons Convention said, no countries can use polio or smallpox as a weapon, but we'll let 9 countries provide peace and security for the world by threatening to use the plague as a weapon. We would say that's morally incomprehensible and unstable. But that's precisely the regime we're living with nuclear weapons. So it's not an acceptable situation. So our cooperation circle is calling upon all of us to work together to end that. We hear a lot about Martin Luther King Day, right? But let me just quote a little bit about what he said when he won the Nobel Prize, and he really had the platform of the world. And it's so interesting, you don't hear this on Martin Luther King Day. I'm just going to quote some of what he said, because I think I'm getting close to my time? Okay, good. Okay, I will. I'm recognizing that. The fact that most of the time, human beings put the truth about the nature and risks of nuclear war out of their minds because it's too painful and therefore not acceptable does not alter the nature and risks of such war. The device of rejection may temporarily cover up anxiety, but it does not bestow peace of mind and emotional security. In a day when vehicles hurtle through outer space and guided ballistic missiles carve highways of death through the stratosphere, no nation can claim a victory in war. If modern man continues to flirt unhesitatingly with war and nuclear weapons, he will transform his earthly habitat into an infernal such that even the mind of Dante could not imagine. I do not wish to minimize the complexity of the problems that need to be faced in achieving disarmament and peace. It is not enough to say we must not wage war. And now here's where the United Religions Initiative comes in. Listen to Martin Luther King and how prescient he was and how he speaks to us today as the solution to the problem, as part of the solution, as a necessary part of the solution. It is necessary to love peace and sacrifice for it. We've inherited a big house, a great world house, in which we have to live together. Black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentiles and Jews, Catholics and Protestants, Muslims and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never again live without each other, must learn somehow in this one big world to live with each other. This means that more and more our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. We must now give an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best of our individual societies. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all. When I speak of love, I'm not speaking of some sentimental and weak response, which is little more than emotional bosh. I'm speaking of a force which all the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which will lead to ultimate reality. I refuse to accept the cynical notion that nation after nation must spiral down a militaristic stairway into the hell of nuclear annihilation. I believe, and I know that all of us here believe, that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. I believe that even amid today's mortar bursts and whining bullets, there's still real hope for a brighter tomorrow. That wounded justice lying prostrate on the blood-flowing streets of our nations can be lifted from this dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men. And I have the audacity to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture, dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. What self-centered men have torn down, men other-centered can build up. And we have before us the choice of yes or no. The no is obvious. We have to reject this pursuit of the love of power. The love of power over the future, the love of power over others, the love of power over nature. And we have to say yes to the power of love. That's what makes us people of spirit. That's the secret sauce that's been missing. We have not stood up and said, this is morally unacceptable. This is an affront to all that we love. And come together and affirm our capacity to love one another. The children in Tehran are terrified today. The children in Tehran are terrified. If you think things are okay, you're asleep. This is not a time for complacency. This is a time for people who care about tomorrow to stand up and say yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.